My name is Leo. I'm 26, and I'm a woodworker. I fix things, mostly for other people, sometimes for myself. I lived alone in the house my grandfather built, a small salt box with good bones on a quiet street in Burlington. He left it to me when he passed, and for the past 3 years, my life had settled into a rhythm as steady and predictable as the grain in a plank of oak. Wake up at 5. Coffee black. Out to the workshop I'd built in the old detached garage. The smell of sawdust and shellac was my morning incense. I'd work until the light faded, planing wood, cutting joints, turning a client's vague idea into a solid, tangible thing. A table, a set of cabinets, a rocking chair. Then I'd go inside, work on my own house, stripping wallpaper, sanding floors, replacing a window pane. Dinner was usually something simple I could eat standing over the sink. I didn't mind the quiet. I preferred it. The world was loud enough. My life was a closed loop. Work, home, sleep. I was competent with a hammer and a saw, less so with people. My relationships, the few I'd had, felt like trying to join two pieces of wood with the wrong kind of joint. They never sat flush. They always wobbled. So I stopped trying. I found a different kind of satisfaction in the clean lines of a finished project, in the solid thud of a well-set post. It was a good life. A stable life. It just wasn't a shared one. Then the house next door sold. It had sat empty for over a year, a dark window on an otherwise occupied street. I'd gotten used to the silence, to the unkempt lawn being the only bit of chaos in my periphery. One Saturday morning in late May, the quiet was broken by the hydraulic hiss of a moving truck's ramp hitting the asphalt. The sound was an intrusion, a stone tossed into the still pond of my routine. I was out in my yard, mending the section of fence that bordered our properties. The wood was old and soft with rot. I was prying a loose board free with a crowbar when I saw her for the first time. She was wrestling a large, heavy box out of the back of her car, the cardboard straining at the seams. She was older than me, maybe late 30s, early 40s. Her hair was a dark blonde, pulled back in a messy knot, and her face was etched with a tiredness that went deeper than the physical strain of moving. The box slipped. She grunted, catching it against her hip just before it fell. A corner tore open, and the spines of several thick hardcovers became visible. Books. Of course. It looked heavy enough to be filled with bricks. She took a deep, frustrated breath and tried to readjust her grip. I stood there for a moment, crowbar in hand, feeling like an intruder on a private struggle. My instinct was to turn away, to retreat back into the comfortable solitude of my own yard. But my grandfather's voice echoed in my head, a low rumble from years past. You see someone needs a hand, you offer it. No questions. I set the crowbar down and walked to the edge of my property. Need a hand with that? I asked. My voice felt rusty, and used for anything more than a brief exchange at the lumber yard. She startled, her head snapping up. Her eyes, a clear, intelligent gray, were wary. She looked at me, then at the box, then back at me. A flicker of something, annoyance, maybe, or just deep-seated caution, crossed her face before being smoothed over. I think I've got it, she said, her voice polite but firm. A dismissal. I just nodded. All right, just offering. I turned to go back to my fence. It was easier that way. No mess, no complication. Wait, she called out. I stopped and looked back. She let out a slow sigh, a surrender. The guardedness in her shoulders seemed to slump just a little. Actually, she said, managing a faint, tired smile. I'd be grateful. It's just heavier than I expected. I walked over, and the scent of rain-soaked cardboard and old paper met me. Books are deceptive, I said, positioning myself on the other side of the box. Where's it going? Just inside the door for now. Everything is just going inside the door for now. We lifted together. It was heavy, but a manageable kind of heavy. I could feel the slightness of her frame through the shared weight. We shuffled up the cracked concrete walk to her front door, which stood wide open, revealing a cavern of stacked boxes and shrouded furniture. We set our burden down in the entryway, the thud echoing in the empty house. She pushed a stray strand of hair from her forehead, leaving a faint smudge of dust on her temple. Thank you, she said, her breath still coming a little short. I'm Clara, by the way. Leo, I said. I live next door. I gestured vaguely with my thumb toward my house. The one with the nice garden, she observed. her gaze lingering on the tidy rows of tomato plants I'd staked a few weeks prior. It's a relief to know I'm not moving in next to a frat house. I gave a small, non-committal shrug. It's quiet. Good, she said, and the word was imbued with a profound sense of relief. Quiet is good. An awkward silence fell between us, filled only by the chirping of birds and the distant hum of traffic. I could see the sheer volume of work ahead of her, a mountain of cardboard and chaos. I felt that familiar urge to retreat, to get back to the tangible problem of my fence. But I also saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands as she rested them on her hips. I've got a dolly in my garage, I offered, the words coming out before I'd really thought them through. A proper appliance dolly. It would make moving the bigger stuff easier. Her first instinct was to refuse. I saw it in the quick tightening of her jaw. But she looked at the monolith of a boxed-up refrigerator sitting on the moving truck's ramp, and her resolve wavered. I couldn't ask you to do that, she said, though it sounded more like a formality than a genuine protest. You're not asking. I'm offering, I said, echoing my earlier words. It's better than watching you try to move a fridge with a bad back tomorrow. She studied my face for a long moment, her gray eyes searching for something I couldn't name. I just stood there, letting her look. I was used to being assessed. Clients did it all the time, trying to gauge if my youth meant I was incompetent. But her gaze was different. It wasn't about competence. It felt like she was trying to read the fine print. Finally, she nodded slowly. Okay, she said. Thank you, Leo. The rest of the afternoon was spent in a rhythm of shared labor. I retrieved the dolly, and together we moved the heaviest items from the truck into the house. The refrigerator, a washing machine, a long, deep sofa shrouded in plastic. We didn't talk much. The work was its own language. A nod to lift, a grunt to set something down, a shared glance to navigate a tight corner. I learned things about her in the silence. I learned she was organized, even in chaos. The boxes were meticulously labeled. Kitchen, dishes. Office, research texts. Bedroom, linens. I learned she was stronger than she looked, insisting on taking her share of the weight. And I learned she owned an astonishing number of books. Box after box, all labeled living room, fiction or office, poetry. As I worked, I noticed the details of her new home. It was a mirror image of my own, but neglected. The paint was peeling around the window frames, a faint, musty smell hung in the air, and one of the floorboards in the living room gave a loud groan every time we stepped on it. My hands twitched with the urge to fix it all, to plane the sticking door, to brace the groaning floorboard, to spackle and sand the cracked plaster. These were problems I understood. By the time the sun started to dip below the trees, the truck was empty. The house was impossibly full, a maze of cardboard, but the job was done. I rolled the dolly back toward my own yard. Leo, wait, Clara called from her doorway. I turned. She was holding 2 bottles of cold water, one of which she offered to me. It's not much, but it's the only thing I can find that's cold. I took it, my calloused fingers brushing against hers. A small, inconsequential touch that sent a jolt through my system, like static electricity on a dry day. Thanks, I mumbled, twisting the cap off and taking a long drink. The cold water was a balm on my dry throat. I should pay you for your time, she said, reaching for the back pocket of her jeans. Don't, I said, maybe a little too quickly. It's just being a neighbor. The idea of taking money from her felt wrong, like charging a friend for a favor. Even though we weren't friends, we were strangers who had spent an afternoon moving heavy objects together. She hesitated, her hand hovering over her pocket. Well, thank you. I mean it. I don't know what I would have done. You'd have figured it out, I said, because it was true. I could see it in her. She was the kind of person who figured things out. It just would have taken longer. She gave me a real smile then, not the tired, polite one from before. This one reached her eyes, crinkling the corners. Probably, she admitted. Well, guess you'll be seeing me often. The words hung in the air for a second. It was a simple statement of fact. We were neighbors, but it felt like something more. A question, maybe. An opening. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't want to retreat. I wanted to step into it. That's what I'm hoping for, I replied. The words surprised me as much as they seemed to surprise her. A faint blush rose on her cheeks. I felt my own ears grow warm. It was too forward, too honest for a man who usually communicated in nods and grunts. I cleared my throat, suddenly desperate to get back to the safety of my own property. I should get back to my fence, I said, gesturing with the water bottle. Right, she said, her smile softening into something more thoughtful. Thanks again, Leo. I just nodded and turned away, my heart hammering against my ribs like a misfiring nail gun. It was a strange and unfamiliar feeling. A few days passed. I finished repairing my fence, replacing the rotten boards with fresh cedar that smelled sharp and clean in the humid air. I saw Clara coming and going, but we only exchanged brief waves. I went back to my routine, but it felt different. The silence from next door was no longer empty. It was filled with the knowledge of her presence. I found my eyes drifting to her windows, wondering what she was doing amidst her fortress of boxes. Then, one evening, I heard a loud crash from her house, followed by a string of frustrated curses. I put down my trowel, I'd been weeding the garden, and walked to the property line. Her living room window was open, and I could see her standing over a heap of wood and books. I walked over to her front door, which was slightly ajar, and knocked gently on the frame. Clara? Everything okay in there? She appeared in the doorway, sawdust in her hair, and a look of sheer defeat on her face. Define okay, she said with a dry, humorless laugh. My bookshelf decided to spontaneously deconstruct itself. She led me inside. A cheap particle-board bookshelf lay in pieces on the floor, its shelves buckled and broken. Her beloved books were scattered around it like casualties of a minor explosion. I guess it wasn't designed to hold actual books, she said, nudging a piece of shattered laminate with her toe. I knelt and picked up a piece of the broken shelving. It crumbled in my fingers. This is just sawdust and glue, I said, my voice filled with a craftsman's disdain. It never stood a chance. No, I suppose not, she sighed, sinking onto the arm of her plastic-covered sofa. Just one more thing to deal with. This was it. This was a problem I could solve. This was my language. I can build you a new one, I said. She looked up, surprised. Oh, no, I couldn't ask you to do that. I'll just find a better one somewhere. You won't find one better than what I can build, I said. It wasn't arrogance, just a statement of fact. I've got some cherry wood in the shop that would be perfect. It won't buckle. I promise. I looked at the pile of books on the floor. They deserve a better home. She looked from the broken shelf to my face, and that searching expression was back in her eyes. Why are you being so nice to me? She asked, the question soft and genuine. I shrugged, feeling that heat rise in my neck again. I like fixing things, I said simply. And your house seems to have a lot of things that need fixing. A small smile played on her lips. That's an understatement. She was quiet for a moment, then nodded. Okay, Leo, build me a bookshelf. The next day, I started. I spent the morning in my shop, the familiar scream of the table saw and the rhythmic scrape of the hand plane filling the air. I measured and cut the cherry planks, the wood a beautiful reddish brown with a grain that flowed like water. I cut dovetail joints for the corners, a detail that was time-consuming but strong and beautiful. It felt good to be working with my hands, to be creating something solid and lasting. In the afternoon, I brought the pieces over to her house to assemble them in place. The living room was still chaotic, but she had cleared a space for me against one wall. As I worked, fitting the joints together with a rubber mallet, she sat at her dining room table, which was buried under stacks of paper, a red pen in her hand. The sound of my work, the soft taps of the mallet, the whisper of sandpaper on wood, mingled with the quiet scratch of her pen. After a while, she got up and disappeared into the kitchen. She returned with a mug of coffee and set it down on the floor beside me. Thought you might need this, she said. Thanks, I said, pausing to take a sip. It was strong and hot, just how I liked it. She watched me work for a moment. You're very good at that, she said. It's like watching a sculptor. It's just measuring and cutting, I said, though I felt a flush of pleasure at the compliment. The wood does most of the work. I don't believe that for a second, she replied, a gentle smile in her voice. She went back to her papers, and we fell back into our comfortable, separate labors. It took me 2 days to finish the bookshelf. I assembled it, sanded it smooth as glass, and applied 3 coats of tung oil, rubbing it into the wood until the grain seemed to glow from within. When it was done, it stood nearly 7 feet tall, solid and beautiful, a testament to good wood and careful work. Clara stood back and just looked at it, her hand over her mouth. Leo, it's beautiful, she whispered. It's the most beautiful piece of furniture I've ever owned. It's strong, I said, which to me was the highest compliment. You can fill it up. It'll hold. And so we did. Together, we unboxed her books and began to fill the shelves. It felt intimate, learning about her through the titles she owned. There were classic novels, collections of poetry, dense historical texts, and a surprising number of books on botany and gardening. Each book I handed her, she would place on the shelf with a kind of reverence. You have a lot of books about plants, I observed, handing her a thick volume on perennial gardens of New England. My mother was a botanist, she said, her voice a little softer. I inherited her library, and her love for it, I guess. I've never had a garden of my own, though. She looked out the window toward her neglected yard. Maybe one day. When the last book was shelved, the room felt transformed. The bookshelf gave it an anchor, a sense of permanence. It wasn't just a room full of boxes anymore. It was starting to look like a home. I have to pay you, she said, turning to me, her expression serious. For the wood, for your time. This is professional work. I'll trade you, I said, the idea coming to me suddenly. For dinner. She blinked. Dinner? Yeah. I saw you have a box labeled kitchen spices. And I'm not a very good cook. It was a clumsy invitation, but it was the only one I knew how to make. Her serious expression melted away, replaced by that smile that made her eyes crinkle. That seems like a ridiculously unfair trade in my favor, she said. Not much of a deal, I guess, I mumbled, suddenly regretting it. No, she said quickly. It's a wonderful deal. I accept. So that evening, I sat at her still-cluttered dining table while she cooked. She made a simple pasta with fresh tomatoes and basil, and the smell filled the house, chasing away the last of the mustiness. We ate with mismatched plates and forks, but it was one of the best meals I'd ever had. We talked more that night than we had in all the days before. I learned she was an editor for a publishing house in Boston, but after her divorce, she'd arranged to work remotely. She wanted out of the city, she said. She wanted a place where she could hear the birds in the morning. She told me about growing up in a house filled with books and classical music, about a father who was a professor and a mother who smelled of soil and lavender. I told her about my grandfather, about how he taught me to use a saw before I could properly ride a bike. I told her about the satisfaction of taking something broken and making it whole again. I didn't tell her about the loneliness, about the quiet that sometimes felt too quiet. I didn't have the words for that. This became our new routine. It started with the bookshelf, but it didn't end there. A week later, I noticed her struggling to open her kitchen window. The old wood had swollen in the humidity. That weekend, I took the sash out, planed the edges down, re-weighted the cords, and had it sliding smoothly in its track by lunchtime. She brought me a pitcher of iced tea and a plate of cookies. The next week, I fixed the loose step on her front porch, securing it with galvanized screws that wouldn't rust. She left a small pot of basil on my doorstep with a note that said, "For your next pasta dish." I was spending more time at her house than my own. My work became a quiet conversation between us. I would fix a sticking door, and she would leave me a slice of homemade pie. I would replace a faulty light switch, and she would make an extra portion of dinner for me. We fell into a rhythm of care, a balanced exchange of his skills for her domestic comforts. We rarely talked about what we were doing. We just did it. It was a language of action, not words, and I was fluent in it. One Saturday, I was on a ladder outside her second-story window, caulking the frame to prepare for painting, when a sleek, expensive-looking black car pulled into her driveway. A man got out. He was tall, dressed in clothes that cost more than my truck, and he moved with an easy, unearned confidence that set my teeth on edge. He walked up to the front door without knocking and let himself in. I paused, the cocking gun held midair. It felt wrong. A few moments later, I heard raised voices from inside. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was sharp, demanding on his end, and strained, defensive on hers. I slowly lowered myself down the ladder, my stomach twisting into a tight knot. This was not my business. This was her life. But the sound of her voice, tight with a stress I hadn't heard before, kept me from walking away. I lingered by the side of the house, pretending to inspect the foundation. The argument grew louder, and then the front door opened again. Clara came out first, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The man followed her. "Clara, be reasonable," he was saying, his voice smooth and condescending. This little pastoral experiment is over. Come back to Boston. Your real life is there. This is my real life, Julian, she said, her voice shaking slightly but holding firm. And you are not a part of it anymore. Don't be dramatic, he scoffed. He glanced around the yard, his gaze dismissive. His eyes landed on my ladder, then on me. He looked me up and down, a sneer playing on his lips. What? You've hired the local help to fix up this dump. I can't believe this is what you've reduced yourself to. Clara flinched as if he'd struck her. My hands clenched into fists at my sides. I wanted to hit him. I wanted to take that smug, arrogant look off his face. But I knew that wasn't what she needed. Violence was his language, not mine. I took a slow breath and walked around the corner of the house, wiping my hands on my jeans. I walked right up to Clara's side and stood there, just slightly in front of her. I didn't say a word. I just looked at him. My presence was a question. Who are you and why are you upsetting her? Julian's eyes narrowed. And who is this? He asked, his voice dripping with disdain. The gardener. Before I could answer, Clara put her hand on my arm. Her fingers were cold. Leo, this is Julian, she said, her voice suddenly steady. My ex-husband. She looked at Julian, her chin lifted. Julian, this is Leo. My boyfriend. The lie hung in the air between the three of us, thick and startling. Julian's smug expression faltered. He looked from her to me, his eyes flicking over my work clothes, my sawdust-dusted hair, my calloused hands. He couldn't make it fit. I didn't flinch. I just held his gaze. I felt Clara's grip on my arm tighten, and I subtly covered her hand with my own. A small, protective gesture. I was an anchor in her storm. Julian let out a short, incredulous laugh. You're kidding me, he said, but the confidence had gone out of his voice. He was looking for a crack in the story, a sign that she was bluffing. We gave him nothing. We just stood there, a united front of quiet defiance. He looked back and forth between us one more time, his jaw working. He had come here expecting to find her alone and vulnerable, easy to manipulate. He hadn't expected me. He hadn't expected this solid, silent wall he couldn't get past. Fine. He finally spat, the word clipped and angry. Have your little fantasy life. Don't come crawling back to me when you get tired of playing house with the handyman. He turned on his heel, got back in his expensive car, and peeled out of the driveway, spraying gravel. We stood there for a long time after he was gone, listening to the sound of his engine fade into the distance. The silence he left behind was immense. Clara's hand was still on my arm, and mine was still covering hers. I could feel her trembling. Finally, she let out a long, shuddering breath and pulled her hand away. I am so sorry, she whispered, not looking at me. You shouldn't have been dragged into that. I shouldn't have said that. It's okay, I said. My own voice sounded rough. No, it's not, she insisted, wrapping her arms around herself again. He was always like that, making me feel small, making everything I cared about seem stupid and worthless. Her voice broke on the last word. She didn't cry, but I could see the tears shimmering in her eyes. I had an overwhelming urge to pull her into a hug, to shield her from the memory of him. But I just stood there, my hands useless at my sides. That wasn't my place. Come on, I said gently. Let's go inside. I followed her into the house and closed the door, shutting out the world. The living room, with its solid new bookshelf and stacks of familiar books, felt like a sanctuary. She sank onto the sofa, looking small and fragile. I went into her kitchen, filled the kettle with water, and put it on the stove to boil, the actions automatic and grounding. I found a box of chamomile tea in her cupboard and 2 mugs. I brought the tea into the living room and set a mug down on the coaster next to her. I sat in the armchair opposite, not too close, giving her space. I didn't say anything. I just sat with her in the quiet, listening to the ticking of the kettle as it cooled. There were no words of comfort I could offer that wouldn't sound hollow. So I offered the only thing I had, my quiet, steady presence. We sat like that for a long time as the afternoon light slanted through the windows and dust motes danced in the sunbeams. She drank her tea. I drank mine. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but clear. Thank you, she said, looking at me over the rim of her mug. For staying. Of course, I said. He hates it when he can't control things, she continued, speaking to the room as much as to me. My job, my friends, what I read. When I finally left, it was like I'd stolen something from him. He can't stand that I'm happy without him. Or at least, that I'm trying to be. She looked so vulnerable in that moment. All her careful guards dismantled. I saw the strong, independent woman who had wrestled with heavy boxes, and I saw the wounded person who was trying to piece her life back together. My heart ached for her. That evening, the air was cool and smelled of impending rain. We were on her porch, sitting on the old, creaky swing that I'd sworn I was going to fix. The sun had set, leaving the sky a bruised purple and orange. The street was quiet, the only sounds the chirping of crickets and the distant rumble of thunder. The tension from Julian's visit still lingered between us, an unspoken thing. But it had changed. It was no longer just the aftermath of a confrontation. It had become something else, something more intimate and charged. "Was it just an act for you?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely a whisper. She was looking at her hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap. "Back there, with Julian." I knew what she was asking. Was my quiet support, my presence at her side, just me playing the part she had assigned me? The question made my chest ache. I turned to look at her. "No," I said, my voice low and earnest. "It wasn't an act." She finally lifted her head and met my eyes. The fading light caught the silver in her gray irises. "Why, Leo?" she asked, the same question she'd asked before, but this time it held a different weight. "Why are you so good to me?" This was the moment. The place where my language of wood and nails and hammers failed me. I had to find the words. I took a breath, the air thick with the smell of ozone. At first, I started, speaking slowly, trying to get the words right. I was just being a neighbor, and I like fixing things. It's what I do. I looked around her porch, at the solid step and the smooth sliding window. But it's not about that anymore. I looked back at her. "I'm not just fixing your house, Clara. I like being here. I like the quiet when you're working and I'm sanding. I like the coffee you make. I like talking to you about books I've never read." I paused, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. "I like being with you." A tear she'd been holding back all day finally escaped and traced a path down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. A faint smile touched her lips, a sad, beautiful, hopeful thing. "Guess you'll be seeing me often, then," she said softly, echoing her words from that first day. This time I was ready. I smiled back, a real smile that I felt all the way to my bones. "That's what I'm hoping for," I said. The admission settled between us, as solid and real as the bookshelf in her living room. It was a foundation, something we could build on. I had been content in my quiet, solitary life. I had my work, my house, my routine. I hadn't known anything was missing until she'd shown up with her boxes of books and her tired, wary eyes. Now, the thought of going back to that silence, a silence not filled with the possibility of her, was unbearable. I had been blind to it, but I wasn't just being a good neighbor. I was falling in love with her. The days that followed felt different. A barrier had been broken, not just with her ex, but between us. The pretense was gone. My acts of service were no longer just neighborly kindness, and her shared meals were no longer just repayment. They were what they had been all along, a form of affection. I started leaving some of my tools in her garage, in a corner she cleared for me. A few of my sweatshirts ended up on the hook by her back door. Her copy of a book on woodworking, which she'd bought to understand my craft, appeared on my nightstand. Our lives were beginning to bleed into one another's, the edges blurring. We started eating dinner together almost every night. It wasn't a formal invitation anymore. It was just assumed. Whoever finished work first would start cooking. We'd eat on her porch, or at my kitchen island, which I'd just finished installing. We talked about everything and nothing. The comfortable domesticity that had been a quiet undercurrent was now the main melody of our days. One Saturday morning, I stood in my yard, looking at the old, rickety fence that separated our properties. It was an eyesore, a remnant of a time when the houses were separate, when our lives were separate. It felt wrong now. I found her in her new garden, kneeling in the dirt, tending to a row of fledgling tomato plants. She looked up as I approached, a smudge of soil on her cheek. She looked happy, peaceful. "I'm taking down the fence," I said, without preamble. She looked at the fence, then back at me, a slow smile spreading across her face. "Is it broken?" she asked, her eyes twinkling. "No," I said. "It's just in the way." "Then I'll get the crowbar," she said. We spent the morning dismantling it, piece by piece. We worked together, pulling the old gray boards free, stacking them in a pile to be repurposed or burned. With each section that came down, the world felt a little bigger, a little more open. Our two small yards merged into one, a single, shared space. When we were done, we stood in the middle of the newly opened lawn, sweaty and dirty, and surveyed our work. "Much better," she said, her voice full of satisfaction. "Yeah," I agreed. "Much better." She turned to me, her face glowing in the morning sun. She took a step closer, rising up on her toes, and pressed her lips to mine. It wasn't like the desperate lie she'd told her ex. This wasn't an act. It wasn't a moment of panic or a gesture of gratitude. This was a choice. Her kiss was soft and sure, a quiet confirmation of everything that had been building between us. It tasted of sunshine and soil and coffee. It tasted like home. When she pulled away, I just looked at her, my hand coming up to cup her cheek. "I was going to build a porch swing," I said, my voice a little rough. "For your porch." "I'd like that," she whispered. "I was thinking maybe we could put it here instead," I said, gesturing to the spot under the big maple tree that now stood in the middle of our combined yard. Between the houses. Her smile was all the answer I needed. Months passed. Summer bled into the fiery colors of a Vermont autumn. The porch swing I built hung from a thick branch of the maple tree, its cherrywood gleaming in the dappled sunlight. We spent most evenings there, a blanket over our laps, watching the sky change. Our life together had found its own quiet rhythm. My house was still a work in progress, but now Clara had opinions on paint colors and tile choices. Her books had migrated from her shelves to mine, filling the gaps. My flannel shirts hung in her closet next to her soft sweaters. We didn't talk about moving in together. It just happened, slowly and naturally, one book and one shirt at a time. I hadn't stayed the night at my own house in weeks. Her house had become our house. One crisp October afternoon, we were in the garden, harvesting the last of the tomatoes and pulling up the spent plants for the season. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. We worked in comfortable silence, the only sounds the rustle of dry leaves and the snipping of my shears. "I never thought I could feel this peaceful," Clara said, pausing to straighten her back. She looked around our shared yard, at the swing, at the two houses sitting side by side like an old married couple. "After Julian, I thought peace was something I'd have to fight for every day. A constant battle." I stopped my work and looked at her. "You don't have to fight for it here," I said. "I know," she said, her voice soft. "It's different. With him, love was this grand, loud thing. Big gestures, expensive gifts, public declarations. It was all about how it looked. But it was hollow, like that particle board bookshelf. I thought about that. About the quiet work of building something strong, piece by piece. About dovetail joints and solid foundations. "This is better," I said. "What is?" she asked. "This," I said, gesturing between us, at the garden, at the life we had built. "The quiet parts. Showing up. Staying when you don't have to. Fixing what's broken." I reached out and gently wiped a smudge of dirt from her cheek with my thumb. "I think love is just this." She leaned into my touch, her eyes closing for a moment. "I think you're right," she whispered. Later that evening, the first real cold of the season had settled in. I built a fire in the fireplace, another one of my projects. The old flue had been blocked, the firebox cracked. I had rebuilt it with new fire bricks and a custom-made steel damper. Now, it drew perfectly, the flames leaping and dancing, casting a warm, flickering glow across the living room. We sat on the rug in front of it, sharing a bottle of wine. Clara was leaning against me, her head resting on my shoulder, a book open but unread in her lap. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the wind sighing outside. "It's funny," she said, her voice a sleepy murmur against my collarbone. "When I moved here, I was just looking for a place to hide. A quiet place to be alone and heal. And?" I asked, running my hand through her hair. She tilted her head to look up at me, her face illuminated by the firelight. "And I found a home instead." I leaned down and kissed her, a long, slow kiss that tasted of wine and wood smoke and a future I'd never known I wanted. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't a loud declaration. It was just a quiet moment, a solid truth. I had spent my life fixing things, making them whole again. I thought I was fixing her house. But all along, she was fixing me, filling in the silent spaces I never knew were empty. We sat there for a long time, watching the fire burn down to glowing embers, perfectly content in the warm, quiet space we had built together.